Welcome to Innovating with Scott Amyx. This is your host, Scott, and today I'm joined by David Ciccarelli, who's the co-founder and CEO of Voices.com. Welcome.
Hey, Scott. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, David, your background is in audio engineering, and you owned and operated a recording studio. At what point did you realize that you were sitting on a market opportunity?
Well, I actually always had a love for sound, and I realized the opportunity was actually more than just doing recording of local, rock and roll bands and hip hop artists and musicians. I actually got my name in the newspaper on my birthday of all days. And because of that same newspaper article, there was some local small businesses, a hair salon and an event management company that wanted a commercial being done. And then the other one wanted a phone system recorded. And I'd actually just met Stephanie the day before, who's now my wife and also co-founder of what's become Voices.com. And she ended up doing those same recordings. And that was kind of our initial aha moment was, wow, if this is just a local opportunity of other small businesses that wanted a voiceover, surely there's a global market for voices in all kinds of applications, which is, of course, what we eventually discovered. So in a way, we were kind of scratching our own itch of, and myself in particular, how do I leverage this recording studio? And this inbound inquiry, I suppose, as a response from that local publicity is really what kind of prompted it. And Scott, it wasn't long before, we built a kind of reinvented this really primitive website at the beginning from a brochure into listing other actors. Stephanie was the only voice actor at the time. It was other freelancers that said, I speak French or German, I do character voices, I do audiobooks and kind of long form narration, that we realized there was a wide variety of, let's call it supply. And concurrently, other businesses, not just the small local businesses, ad agencies and video production companies would find this website. And so that was really the realization of, rather than us doing the production ourselves, we should pivot, to use that term, and reorient ourselves around running a two-sided marketplace.
I love these stories. The reason is sometimes I think entrepreneurs, we tend to kind of forcefully create a product and kind of push it down the methodology, hoping that the product is going to be successful. But I think what you're showing is that, when we are open-minded and allow for things to form organically based on market signals and demand, and to craft solutions kind of in an agile fashion, it tends to be a better market fit. And I think one of the things that you point out, and this kind of predates even the freelance shared economy that we experience today, which is that the voices and the voice actors was very fragmented. You allow for them to have a way to distribute and have the visibility so that they could actually consistently get more gigs. So how exciting. Now, one of the things that I found out about your background and your journey is that your startup was bootstrapped for quite a long time, including the Great Recession of the 2008. So I'm just curious to see, what was that like, and how did you manage to survive out of that when others really didn't?
We, I think of financing and getting access to capital for startups as fundamentally having three sources. And the first source is cash from customers, which really means, and it's often overlooked in the startup ecosystem, of actually building something of value, delivering that in a product or service to an end customer who's paying you, and hopefully in a timely manner. But cash from customers is a first source. And when we started, our business model was actually a subscription-based business where the voice actor would pay a modest subscription fee, I think at the time of $49. We had two tiers, $49 and $99 a year, not a month, a year, to gain access to creating a profile. This is, again, predates LinkedIn or Facebook or any other place, but create a profile where you could upload sample recordings of your voice. And in addition, be included in our search engine, and ultimately gaining access to job opportunities that were posted to the platform. So we actually had a recurring revenue model right from the, it was really a membership-based site right from the very get-go. So cash from customers is the first one. Then, of course, if that's working, there's a tendency you want to accelerate that further. So let's call that, cash from taking on some debt, where you're maybe borrowing money from a financial institution. And Scott, our first loan was for $30,000, and then we hustled to pay that off early, which we then reapplied for a $50,000 loan, and then $100 and $250 and $900 and $2 million was the highest loan that we were able to secure. Which at a certain point we realized if we want to continue to grow the company on this path, we're likely, we probably got to the end of the road of a traditional bank being willing and comfortable, despite having cash flow and customers, where they would be comfortable. There's not really a lot of assets that they could use as security. So that is what prompted us to pursue that next leg of the journey, which is cash, and is really from an investor, an equity investor, which, as you well know, but maybe for some of us, some of those listening, is really they're not lending you the money which you pay back. They're actually buying a portion of the company, and so they're investing, and now they might own 10 or 20 or 30% of your company, but you really do have a partner at that point. So you're right. We did bootstrap really all until about just over a year and a half ago, and we're able to raise our Series A, capital raise from Morgan Stanley Expansion Capital, and they're based out of San Francisco. And they predominantly deal with tech companies, high growth tech companies, and have a preference, if you will, for founder run and bootstrapped companies, and being kind of first money in. Where a lot of a lot of those kind of war wounds have already had, we've proved the product market fit. We've proved that there's a customer base, that there's a revenue model, that there indeed is a market out there. But happy to kind of go tell more about that story if you're interested. But that was really the capital raising journey itself.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, David. And I wanted to explore a little bit more in terms of that journey, in the sense of the role of governments and the ecosystems as it pertains to where you're based, which is Canada. And I think you also have an office in New York. But specifically Canada, you've been supported in some capacity through the Federal Economic Development Agency for Southern Ontario. You've worked with the Business Development Bank of Canada, as well as the Canada Technology Accelerator. So share with us your perspective. And what I'm trying to get at is, sometimes I think some kind of the neoclassical economists like myself, we tend to sometimes think that it should just be the private sector only, but reality is it's a private public sector support that allows for a thriving innovation ecosystem.
And that's exactly it. I think, for a lot of the most difficult years of any entrepreneur is those early years, when you are trying to validate, likely a hypothesis that there's a market, and B, your solution to what you believe is a problem that market is having, that your solution is valid, it's going to work, it's going to solve their problem in its entirety, and thirdly, that there's a willingness to pay. So when you take all of that kind of confluence of factors, the headwinds certainly are against a entrepreneur starting a company. And so, as you mentioned, we try to keep our ear to the ground for programs, government funding programs, which are often repayable loans, but at very favorable interest rates. Some are favorable in terms of not necessarily the interest rate, but maybe the payback period is a longer, more prolonged payback period. So you weigh these factors. Of course, there's time and energy that goes into applying for them, which can sometimes be a deterrent to other entrepreneurs. Is it worth kind of going after the capital? But we found them to be, when they're, as they say, when it's specifically around the capital itself, they're tremendously rewarding, because you're not giving up equity in your company. That's the real reason. And they are designed for small businesses, and usually they're region specific. So especially if you're in a region really there's similar programming around the world, not just in Canada or the Small Business Loan Administration in the US, but there's similar programming around the world. Often you can find kind of the local representative for that office or for that particular program, who can kind of walk you through that experience. So they're not just capital, infusions into the company. An alternative was, as you mentioned, this Canadian Technology Accelerator was actually put on by the Trade Commissioner Service of the Government of Canada, that afforded us a opportunity to, I'm going to say, quote unquote, taste the market in the US. And so what that means is they provided a hot desk, kind of a co-working space in San Francisco for about 6 months. And, some guidance and advisory. We were connected with an executive coach and a mentor. And then some kind of once a month, like a few days of more formalized programming. But the concept is, hey, rather than taking a complete blind leap of faith into a new geographic market that you've likely proven out with data or some analysis, that's where your customers are or you believe them to be. Rather than that blind leap of faith, they provide you what's referred to often as a soft landing. It might look like, $2,000 or $3,000 for a plane ticket and kind of the first week of accommodations, just so you can land okay. But then you're pretty much, you're on your own in terms of other ongoing expenses after. But that Canadian Technology Accelerator we went once through an opportunity in San Francisco, as I mentioned, and then again in New York City. And so they have them around the world at this point, and each of them has a bit of a different theme or flavor, but it's the same premise. How do we take high potential Canadian tech companies and give them an opportunity to test out markets around the world?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when people think about Israel and they refer to it as the startup nation, what they don't sometimes understand is the role that government plays. So, for instance, something equivalent to $700,000 is given to very early stage startups that are affiliated with these tendered or approved accelerator types. And that basically allows for kind of a de-risking and a capitalization, frankly, at that early stage that wouldn't be otherwise possible. Mm-hmm. And as part of the reason I think there is that sustained, systematic growth and innovation that happens in Israel and Canada as an example of it. I want to pivot and talk a little bit about Voices.com in the context of why is the human voice so special, especially when everybody is texting and it just, we don't really pick up the phone or talk anymore, but why is it still important?
Well, this is, obviously near and dear to my heart. Our mission is that we want to be the place where the world finds its voice, and voice is distinctly unique in its humanity, if you will. Everyone has, just like you have fingerprints, you have a voice print as well that is unique to you. And we believe that voice has a special ability to actually, inform and entertain and educate audiences through a different medium. It's not visual, of course. You're not watching a video or reading text, but you're listening and you're learning that way. And there's a large swath of the population that actually learns best through listening. I'm certainly one of those people. I have over 1,000 audiobooks on my iPhone. And so, there's a tendency to, jump to communication methods that are maybe low cost or easier to produce, like through text, or maybe more flashy like video. But often what we find is the narrative in video is actually told best through the human voice. And so that's what we're really trying to do is aggregate a community and bring together a community of professional voice actors and making them available to brands and agencies that are trying to communicate in an authentic way.
So you talk about something that's called sonic brand, which is very interesting. What exactly does that mean, and why is it important for organizations to build this sonic brand?
Well, historically, we've all thought of brands of being the visual identity, right? It's the symbol, it's the word mark, it's even as I say, a word or some graphic that represents an organization and kind of the product or services that ultimately differentiate it from others within their space. A sonic brand is, let's call it a subset of that, more than the visual, and it complements more than the visual identity. We're finding a lot of organizations now are realizing that one way to differentiate themselves further is how they sound. And of course, companies haven't needed to think about this, but in a world of 100 million smart speaker and kind of digital assistants, more broadly digital assistants, but smart speakers are already deployed in 100 million out there in the wild. Digital assistants are on almost everyone's phone at this point. And then there's other kind of communication touch points, like as basic as a phone system where you call into a phone and you're hearing a sound logo, if you will, where it's often like a chime of 3 or 4 notes or 3 or 4 or 5 seconds. It's quite short, but it creates a familiarity that indeed you've called the right place, or the video you're watching. We often see these kind of as a pre-roll into the company's official video. And there's some really common ones out there you might think of in commercial use of, the Intel Inside chime, or the AOL who you've got mail from years gone by. But we're seeing a resurgence of sound being considered in the branding landscape as a way to further personify their organization. And not only is it just sound in terms of music, but often in terms of the choice of voice that they're making, whether it's the voice on their message, on their phone system, to reuse that example, or even in their commercials or corporate training videos or how-tos and product tutorials. If you have brand guidelines in terms of how the collateral should look, you probably want to consider how you should sound as well too. And I think it just ties together overall level of professionalism and enhances the communication that you're already making to your community or your end audience.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And just to kind of reinforce that, years and years ago, in one of my startups, as part of our alpha product development, I had actually created a voiceover. And we actually did a customer feedback survey, essentially a questionnaire on this, and some interviews, focus interviews. And the response was, who in the world is doing the voiceover? You need to get rid of that person and get somebody professional. Interesting enough, now I'm running a podcast, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Clearly not listening to feedback. Anyways, so let's talk about kind of envisioning where the future is going, especially as it pertains to artificial intelligence. It's starting to get to a point where you have 3D avatars, CGI, and AI that's able to take bits and pieces of real human action or motion and even sound and replicate it and actually have them say things that they wouldn't have actually said, or it wasn't actually them themselves. But more importantly, even in blockbuster movie context, we're starting to see, and this is where potentially the future is, that we may not even really need the full real human footage, but that perhaps fictional avatars could become the future. And we're starting to see some of that with even voices, and especially in context of speech, voice recognition, like Alexa, like Google Assistants, and others, but also personification as robots start to have their own voices. So tell us about the human voice and the importance as things change in the mediums and the substrates that they're on.
Absolutely. Well, you know what? This was a critical and kind of key question during that capital raising journey that we went on, particularly when speaking with investors. And ultimately, the question did come from Morgan Stanley, which was, what is the existential threat to voices.com? You're a marketplace where people hire real human professional voice actors. Is there a day where that is no longer needed? And our belief is that day, as much as that is certainly a threat, that day is still pretty far into the future. The tipping point will really be when the robotic or synthetic voice is indistinguishable from the human voice. And I think there's a time and a place where, a synthetic voice makes sense, And then there's other use cases, if you will, where you absolutely want a professional, a person, a human that's breathing life into that script. And the way I would frame this up is if you could visualize a 2x2 matrix, where on the bottom you have kind of your horizontal axis, like the duration of the recording itself. And then because really the longer the recording, you know, people suffer from, you know, kind of listening fatigue. You can only listen to a robotic voice for probably, call it 3 to 5 seconds. It's a pretty short window. I know I've never listened to a whole article being read out, and certainly enjoyed it. However, you know, and certainly not a magazine or a book. Those are, you know, when the longer the recording, the higher the likelihood is and suitability that you want to work with a voice actor. But there's then the other kind of axis, the vertical axis is I would almost say like, you know, quality in the sense of how important is quality to that recording. And there's actually a lot of use cases where it's not a creative production, you know, where think of like greetings in an airport, or, you know, an automated attendant at a parking garage. These kind of turn-by-turn directions on a GPS. When the information is, I'm going to say, has the potential to change over time, or it's like there's a high frequency of the information changing, and it's candidly not creative, then of course a synthetic voice, you know, makes a lot of sense there. But the more you get out into this kind of creativity space, it's a long recording. You know, the audience needs to be able to stay engaged, in which case working with a voice actor where it kind of is, I'm going to say, entertainment type content or educational type content. That's where voice actors are most suitable. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I mean, there's lots of tests of like, you know, the human versus robot, you know, A/B split tests, these kind of listening tests that you can do online. But in my opinion, some of them are slightly skewed because they're only playing a half a second or 2 or 3 seconds. It's actually pretty hard to make that to make that discernment between human or robot on a short recording. But there are audio kind of artifacts. There's almost a buzziness to that. Just like in graphic design, you know, it'd be like the equivalent, the analogy would be like a pixelated picture. There's almost this buzziness to, you know, over-engineered and, you know, synthetic voice that is out there. But I do, you know, we certainly, of course, advocate for working with voice actors, are supportive of the community. And, you know, we're in a discovery and kind of research phase of understanding the technology and how it kind of fits and coexists, if you will, with the profession that's been around for the last 100 years.
Well, I think just to kind of wrap it up here is that, you know, the real question we're really asking is there real long-term sustainability of the need for the human race? And I would like to believe that the answer is yes, I hope so. And voice is such an important dimension of what makes us human, and the brightness, the tone, the cadence, the personality that can be depicted and derived from one's voice is so important. And even the original source, I mean, the AI has to get it from somewhere before it can start to permeate it and create derivatives. So the human voice is not going anywhere anytime soon, I don't think. We only have 30 seconds remaining, David. So my last question for you is, can you share a product failure that you've experienced and the lessons learned that you can share with others?
Well, one of the product failures we experienced early on is really anytime, candidly, we make things too complicated. We just layer on features, you know, in advance of validating that this is something that a customer would actually want. So of course now we have you know, follow kind of a Google design process on, you know, again, having a hypothesis, starting with a problem, an actual defined problem that our customers are facing, you know, develop a hypothesis of how to solve that, build a lo-fi prototype, and I'm talking like boxes with, you know, no color. It can sometimes be as lo-fi as a paper prototype, and showing that to people either in fellow employees here at Voices or actually doing a screen share or something along those lines and getting some preliminary feedback. It saves all kinds of time from building not only hi-fi design prototypes, but actually the programming and development, and then have to kind of wind that down or undo it afterwards. There's been lots of features that we've tried that just kind of haven't quite made the mark. One was a voting feature of like the most kind of popular voices. We ultimately realized it's more important to tie that to a financial transaction of somebody who actually hired them, because their vote, if you will, has a lot more credibility. Just different ways of formatting an audio player, because voice is an intangible and I can't read. I actually have to click play to evaluate it. More words aren't going to help me determine if the voice is good. So I think it's these kind of nuances that working with an intangible like voice and something that somebody, the end user, actually has to click play and engage with, how to design an entire experience on a platform around the act of listening as opposed to looking has been one of our biggest challenges, but also those triumphs, if you will, when you feel like you've really nailed it.
All right, so today I've been joined by David Ciccarelli, who is the CEO of Voices.com. David, thanks for joining today.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks so much.